Hello, hello. 1, 2, 3. Hi. Am I hearable? Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Okay. This is good?
Affordable, simple meals start with the helpful chef. Try this hash brown and sausage breakfast casserole to start your day. Or cook up these big ranch chicken nuggets for lunch or dinner. Buy both recipes at stopandshop.com. That's a lot of living. So it looks like the highest
Hey, what time is it?
Oh no.
We getting there?
What's that?
Are we
Counting to 10 for me?
me? Okay. In French?
3, 1, 5.
That's not French. I don't know much, but despite your
6,
best efforts, that's not French.
7, 8, 9.
Oh no. It's exciting. I think you'll be fine. Really, I think you'll be fine. They are a little shocking, but I took out some of the. I took. Ooh.
Good evening, everybody.
Oh.
Can you all hear me okay? All right, great. My name is Kristen Failhaber. I'm the Assistant Director at the Museum of Old Newbury, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to Secure the Shadow, Victorian Spirit and Post-Mortem Photography with Bethany Groff Dorau. Thanks to all of you for attending tonight, especially to our members and volunteers that are here today. If you aren't a member, I'd love to invite you to become a member, and you can do that at newburyhistory.org/membership. A special thanks to Mass Humanities Bridge Street sponsorship that has made this program possible tonight for free for everybody. An additional thanks to James Dorau, president of Ipswich Ale Brewery, for providing beer and bartending services tonight, and to our board members who have provided wonderful refreshments. A few housekeeping notes. Please mute your cell phones. Restrooms are right outside that door there. And with that, Bethany Groff Dorau may need no introduction, but she's going to get one. She is the executive director of the Museum of Old Newbury. She is the author of 2 books that we have here for sale, A Newburyport Marine in World War I, The Life and Legacy of Evan Bradbury, and A Brief History of Old Newbury. She's published articles in the New York Times, New England Quarterly, the Encyclopedia of American History, and Historic New England Magazine. She holds a master's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts, and she lives in West Newbury with her family. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much. I also have to thank Port Media, who is filming us from the back room. So I have to be extra careful. Oh, did you hear them? Do that again. We stuck them in the grotto. They're back there somewhere. Can I ask you a favor, James Dorau in the back row? There is a remote control on the right-hand side of the mantle over there. Can you bring that to me, please? Would you like to have it? I would like to have it. Wow, it's going to be that kind of a night, huh? Man, this is awesome. You people, dead bodies and innuendo, you're my kind of people. Thank you so much, sir. Oh, James Vincent. His middle name is Vincent. Okay, there we go. Just me and the chop suey sign illuminating the Museum of Old Newbury. Well, apparently I just have to show pictures of dead bodies to get all of you here together. This has been a funny process. I started this. My interest in this actually springs from a study I did in grad school about Victorian mourning customs. And it sort of evolved from there. So I spent a lot of time looking at these images, and then I spent a lot of time getting ready for this presentation. I know it's not going to seem like it, but I did. And it's so interesting. These things are so fun. I'm looking at all these details. I mean, fun. And then at some point, I just started feeling a little weirdly queasy, and I realized I'd spent about 4 hours looking at pictures of dead bodies. So then I thought I'd better send a note out saying, you are like it's in the title, this post-mortem photography. Like, we really are going to see this stuff. So anyway, I hope that really the exciting thing about it to me is how much it reveals about how people thought about death and therefore how they thought about life. So let's get going on this. Okay. So I will also say that I'm not a photographer. I'm one of those people that's perfectly happy to take photographs with my phone, but really has no idea how the process works. I am trying to change that. I really should change that, in particular, since we have one of the most incredible photography collections in the country. This is an incredibly well-photographed early community, and we have so many of those images here and also at the library. So it's really pretty exciting. So I am fascinated by Victorian photography because it vividly illustrates a culture at the crossroads between faith and science. Oh, is that sounding sort of topical? And this is the tension which I believe defines the Victorian world. Now, those people who are real true historians yell at me for saying Victorian and then talking about the United States. I will say I do this in part because Queen Victoria herself had such an impact on the way that this particular set of customs was carried out. So just roll with it. And I also do use some images from England, but Anyway, the photographs that we'll look at today are from a period roughly in sync with Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. And it is she herself who is largely, that was her reign, not her lifespan. It is she herself who is largely responsible for the heightened culture and rituals of mourning that define the period in both Europe and America. Queen Victoria defined the infant mortality odds, giving birth to 9 children and seeing them all into adulthood. Her tragedy was matrimonial. I will also say the saddest, most tragic photograph in this entire presentation I'm going to show you now so we can get out of the way. It's the funeral of Butch the dog in 1900. The back row comes up. I just had to get that out of the way. That was the one that I was like, oh, really? This is, again, a photograph from 1900. This is a girl having a funeral for her dog. And then she's photographed having a funeral for her dog. Anyway, his name is Butch. It was recorded. Write stuff on your pictures, friends. We know this dog's name is Butch. In 1861, Queen Victoria's beloved Prince Albert contracted what was most likely stomach or intestinal cancer, but was explained as typhoid fever, and quickly died at age 42. The Queen was inconsolable, and she turned her grief into a social, cultural, and fashion event. And I didn't know until today that there is a post-mortem photograph of Prince Albert. This is actually from the collection of the royal family, and there you go. So Queen Victoria actually kept this photograph, didn't know this either, on his side of the bed for the rest of her life. Wow. That's devotion. Sorry, honey. That's not going to happen. No. Gosh. Okay, for the next 4 decades, Queen Victoria wore black, though she relaxed somewhat in her later years. She wore black underwear, not the fun kind you wear to Deb's Halloween party. She wrote in black ink on black edged paper. She drove a black carriage with black horses. You get the picture. And Queen Victoria herself was photographed. Oh, this is her. Wait a minute. That's her. There you go. She's in mourning. And there she is post-mortem. I also didn't know this existed until today. This is also in the royal collection. Oh, you want to see her face? That was like a plant. That was awesome.
Oh, never mind.
That is a...
Yeah, that's better. Is that a post-mortem picture over her post-mortem?
So that is a post-mortem. That's a deathbed photograph of Prince Albert. He's not dead yet, but he was on his deathbed, and it's actually, I believe it's a lithograph. I don't think it's actually a photograph. Okay, there's lots and lots of deathbed images of Prince Albert because his death, which I don't want to downplay this, it was genuinely a tragic event in their lives, but it was also this thing that spurred this incredible international kind of reaction. So that's why I'm talking about it just a teeny bit flippantly. But yes, Queen Victoria herself was photographed post-mortem. That is an excellent question. She was 80-something.
And never remarried, obviously.
Died in 1901. Nope, never remarried. I don't want to hear the theories about the Scottish carriage driver or whatever. There you go. Okay. It is not for me to decide. Just saying, Scotsmen are hot. Okay. And Scottish women. Also hot. Okay. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on our side of the pond, 4 years later, on April 14th, 1865, threw the United States into paroxysms of grief. A week after his death, a train carrying his coffin left Washington, D.C. on its way to Springfield, Illinois. The train carried not only Lincoln's body, but that of his son Willie, who had died in 1862 at the age of 11. It traveled through 180 cities and 7 states, over 1,600 miles, with 3 people on board. I'm sorry, 300 people on board. At each stop, Lincoln's coffin was taken off the train, placed on a horse-drawn hearse, and led by solemn procession to a public building for viewing. In some cities, mourners waited for over 5 hours to pay their respects. That's his funeral coach. The 19th century was a volatile time in America. Industrial growth, immigration, and urbanization produced a myriad of extremes and contradictions. Extraordinary power accompanied extraordinary industrial extraordinary poverty accompanied extraordinary industrial wealth, and there was an emphasis on self-restraint and, paradoxically, sensational public displays of emotion and wealth. Industrial exploitation led to simmering resentment. I love this, especially since I didn't correctly read the word on the very top. I thought this was a much more interesting print than it is. And the rise of labor agitation, while the solidification of women's domestic role accompanied the beginning of the women's movement. So it's a time of immense contradictions. And perhaps the greatest contradiction of all was the tension between faith and science. Now, science I put in a serious air quotes here, because science was really used to describe anything that seemed to have proof. So I'm just going to say that. Again, too soon, right? Okay. Even if the circumstances of the proof were dubious. It's nowhere as strong as when it comes to death and dying. Some context can be gleaned by looking at statistics from the United States Census Bureau records, which it calls morbidly, there's a report called morbidly expectation of life. The typical American woman bore an average of 7 children in 1800. She had her first child around age 23 and proceeded to bear children at approximately 2-year intervals until her early 40s. Beginning, again, this is an average. Beginning in the late 18th century, however, Americans began slowly to have fewer children. Between 1800 and 1900, the birth rate fell 40%, and even more sharply among the middle and upper class. Where the typical American mother bore 7 children in 1800, the average number of children had fallen to 3.5 by 1900. And instead of giving birth to her last child at the age of 40 or later, by 1900, the typical American woman bore her last child at the age of 33. The fertility rate in America commenced its sustained decline long before that of child mortality, however, which hovered around 43% until the 1870s and then began a slow decline. This contrasts with the more typical demographic transition in which mortality decline precedes or occurs simultaneously with fertility decline. In other words, if you think your kids are going to actually have a better chance of living, you'll have fewer of them. And that was not happening. And of course, statistics deal with aggregates. There were plenty of people who lived into their 90s. Many families saw all of their 17 children live to adulthood, and others saw their entire families wiped out in one day. But what is clear, any way you look at it, is that there were fewer children being born as the century wore on, and nearly half of them were still dying. So much has been made of the deeper investment of Victorian parents in their fewer children. There are some significant studies about how the nature of childhood was invented in the 19th century. This is a sort of an area of study, the study of the history of childhood. Before you went from, basically infants to adults. That was this whole idea of this elongated adolescence that we are all living with right now. Some of us are living with right now. Did not really exist. So humans have ritualized and pondered death since the beginning of recorded history. But in the 19th century, for the first time, it seemed that science, again, in air quotes, could offer some hope for the bereaved, some thinning of the veil. Spirits spoke from beyond the grave through a variety of ingenious scientific means, through cabinets, electrographs, planchettes, and special tables. At the same time, belief in the possibilities of science was increasingly at odds with traditional Christian faith. The result of the urge to believe in both science and the supernatural led many to spiritualism, the belief that the spirit lived on after death, and if given the right medium, could communicate with the living. It's a very popular sort of school of thought, sort of pseudo-religion in the 19th century. This incorporated elements of Christianity, such as the presence of heaven and angels, but offered proof of life after death, eliminating the need for faith. So that central tenet of Christianity, no need, we can prove it. There, of course, was also an element of sociability and fun to this as well. Like tonight, people have always just sometimes wanted to be scared and thrilled a bit. So actually, Americans also experienced increased mobility during this time. I got a little ahead of myself, but that's okay. I'll let you feast your eyes on Elizabeth Royal. Family farms were outgrown, and the traditional communities were often fragmented, and people communicated about important events like a death through these increasingly complex and ritualized forms of communication. The dead were memorialized through art long before photography. I believe, and I would love to be wrong and see evidence of it, I think this is the first American post-mortem painting. the earliest one I can find. This is Elizabeth Royal on her deathbed in 1747. In general, however, memorial art tended to represent the deceased as they were when alive, rather than at the time of their death or just after. Clues that the subject of portraits were deceased, a wilted flower, a finger pointed downward, were far from universally employed and can be very misleading. They are the subject of pretty virulent disagreement among art historians, so I'm going to leave that one to the experts. But anyway, you have that there. So there are examples as early as the 16th century. This is the lovely and talented Anne of Brittany here, reclining upon her deathbed in 1514. There she is. Though again, most of these subjects appear to be dramatically clinging to life, not actually and obviously dead. One remarkable exception to this is the death mask, which is just what it sounds like. Oh, wait, there's Washington, dramatically clinging to life at his deathbed. Look at me. That's what happens when you add slides at the last possible minute. One remarkable exception is the death mask, which is just what it sounds like. This could be a whole other talk. Oh, maybe that will be next Halloween's talk. Everybody bring out your death masks. So next year I'll get back to you. So there are a huge variety of death masks. And this, again, was the idea that there was something special about being captured in the moment of death or the moment just after death. And something universal could be understood by capturing the face in that moment. And I can't say that they're wrong. I also now hate that font, but I hope you'll all forgive me for that. It's kind of cool. Works with the subject matter. William Lloyd Garrison's death mask, or what has been described as William Lloyd Garrison's death mask, is a cherished part of our collection here at the Museum of Old Newbury. It's right upstairs. His eyelashes are to die for. They are. And after a very, very difficult life, he looks peaceful. It's difficult to say how post-mortem photography became so widespread, but it's clear that as soon as portraits could be readily commissioned by the public, pictures of the dead began to be taken. It's no accident that most early post-mortem images are of infants and the elderly. We can assume that no images existed of these people in life. Remember, when you're looking at a post-mortem daguerreotype, an early daguerreotype, you're looking at people who were born around the American Revolution. So it was a time when there were very few representations of ordinary people. Babies who died in their first year also probably had never sat for a photographer. It's not a stretch to assume that in many cases these were the only images of that loved one available to their family. In addition to the practical desire to have at least one portrait of Grandpa, dead or alive, there is another motive, which we talked about a little bit in the death masks, which is this idea of the capture of the spirit, this secure the shadow. In the early days of photography, the public had limited understanding of the technical and chemical processes needed to produce an image. Even if the mechanics of the thing were understood, exactly how the image came to be represented was not particularly well understood. Artists specializing in post-mortem portraiture played on this and advertised their ability to capture a soul in flight, preserve some measure of the departed, etc. One photographer assured that with skill, the first moments of death can be returned to the last moments of life. There's a spiritual component to post-mortem photography, a desire to keep some part of the spirit of the deceased alive. And as early as 1841, that's 1841, the good people of Newburyport were invited to the rooms of Messrs. Brooks and Young to secure the shadow ere the substance fade. Though these images are haunting, it's also very important to point out that death was much more visible in the 19th century than it is today. The British sociologist Geoffrey Gorer makes an interesting observation that we have flipped sex and death with the Victorians, that we are much less familiar with death. Of course, I would argue they were also quite familiar with sex, but 17 children. But we are much more open about talking about sex than we are about death, and the opposite was true in the 19th century in England. So people died, people were born and died in their homes. There was no hospital to go to. They were washed and prepared for burial by their families. They were not embalmed until the Civil War necessitated embalming to ship bodies back from the battlefield. So there was a time limit on the process. So These were very intimate acts, and they were carried out by family members. People were very familiar with dead bodies and with death. And amazingly, I have seen some letters in various collections that I'm familiar with where people will write to distant cousins and describe the death of a relative in their house. And they will go on for pages. Every noise, every gasp, it's this sort of painting this picture of this long process. And there was something about sharing that with distant relatives that felt like you were bringing a community back together in the way that, when people would come and see their neighbors when they were dying. Bodies were laid out, as I said, and funerals were held at home. In Victorian London and in many cities in America, the night's dead were removed from busy thoroughfares by paupers' hearses. There was a physical familiarity with death that spilled over into the practice of removing locks of hair, for weaving into mourning jewelry, and the washing and preparing of the body. That's pretty cool. I don't know if any of you are familiar or have any pieces of hair jewelry, but they're pretty amazing what they could do with human hair. That's a whole other talk too. I got Halloween's covered for the rest of my life. Of course, excuse me. Of course, I will also say that early photography here has to be, we have to talk a little bit about Dr. Henry Coit Perkins, who took some of the earliest daguerreotype images of this fair city, although none of these have dead bodies in them. These are some of the earliest daguerreotypes in the country, and they are part of the collection of the Museum of Old Newbury. So he announced in the paper that he had brought the daguerreotype process to this country in 1839. The manner in which the deceased are portrayed changed over the second half of the 19th century. Though there are regional and ethnic variations, post-mortem portraits tended to follow cultural patterns of mourning in interesting ways. During the period from 1840 to 1865, adult portraiture focused on a more or less unvarnished view of death. Adults were generally photographed upper body. Often they were photographed sitting up or in a coffin or laying on a bed. Children were often shown sleeping. They were often shown full body. Additional beautifications were unusual. The view of death is fairly stark, and often parents are holding children or siblings are posing with a deceased sibling. Often the deceased is represented prepared for burial with eyes closed, jaw tied shut, with minimal props. Full body images do often show the coffin as well. Children are more sentimentalized, but still clearly dead, often held in a mother's lap or in a draped coffin. The portraits represented a significant emotional, significant financial commitment to the deceased as well. On August 21st, 1851, again, quite early, daguerreotypist S. Griffin Morrill placed the following notice in the Newburyport newspaper. Daguerreotypes taken of sick and deceased persons at their place of residence on reasonable terms. So you could get a photographer to come to your house and take a picture of your dead or dying loved one right here in Newburyport. It is significant that Merrill mentions that his postmortem portraits are made at reasonable prices. Daguerreotype portraits of the dead were far more expensive than ordinary portraits, and daguerreotype portraits themselves were not cheap. They became cheap at the end of the period. The daguerreotypist was called in immediately upon the death of their subject, and portraits would most often be taken in the home. The journey with fragile equipment and props added risk and expense for the daguerreotypists, which was passed to the family. One wonders if the contact with dead bodies added to the price. But of course, there was the flip side, which is they would not move. They were compliant subjects. It's true. In 1847, competing Pleasant Street daguerreotype studios offered their services photographing the dead. The Thompson Shop, which was new in 1847, advertised pictures copied from paintings or other daguerreotypes. A good likeness can be taken of the dead, often a representation of quiet sleep. This is right over Richdale's. Oh, wow. There you go. This is a later photograph. This was a company that was in and out. This is also the Eben Bradbury Pharmacy. Some of you know I wrote a book about Eben Bradbury. It was a good deal later, but my world sort of collided there. An 1848 advertisement for the noted daguerreotype studio of Southworth and Hawes noted that, quote, "We take miniatures of deceased persons either at our rooms or at private residences. We take great pains to have miniatures of deceased persons agreeable and satisfactory, and are often so natural as to seem, even to artists, in a quiet sleep. This is, yeah, beefcaketodaguerreotypes.com. So this is Albert Southworth. He talked shop with his colleagues at a trade conference. He said, quote, "The way I do it is just to have them dressed and laid on the sofa. Just lay them down as if they're asleep, then place your camera and take your pictures just as they would look in life, as if they were standing before you." Some sitters chose instead to sit with a portrait of a loved one. These are both Southworth photos from Southworth and Hawes from Boston. He was an exceptionally talented photographer. Some people chose instead to have themselves photographed with a portrait of a loved one, or they inserted a loved one into a family portrait later on, as with this Connecticut family. Oh, there you go. So there's the original photograph, and there's the young one. So this is a portrait that was taken of a little girl who had died by the time this portrait was taken.
Wow.
So they photographed the family with the space for her. This one's rough going. In some cases, a deathbed image would be taken and later paired with a post-mortem image. This is fairly unusual, but as with this boy up top, where he is photographed just before his death and just after. A souvenir of Ellen Rose Riley shows a British triptych that includes a post-mortem image in the middle. So there's Ellen as a young woman on the left, Ellen as a young bride on the right, and Ellen dead in the middle. You can skip the one in the middle for when you carry around pictures of me. By the 1860s, photographic portraiture was much more affordable, and post-mortem photography was fairly commonplace. The subject of these portraits were often depicted as being asleep, with all the obvious trappings of death removed. The very concept of being dead has changed, and that's sort of where this interesting trio of images comes from. We moved fairly quickly. This image on the top left is actually supposed to be an angel. It's got wings, but of course it looks a little grim. And then we have the ring, the urn, and sort of urn and willow imagery in the 18th and early 19th century that took over. And then Darwin shot it all to hell by saying maybe God hadn't created the world after all, and everybody got really confused and started, theorizing about what death meant and what happened when you died after all. So I found two. Actually, this was just on the Tombstone Tuesday. This is a headstone in Andover. I'm going to read it to you. But this, did I put it in here? Oh, yes. The epitaph on this stone, this is from 1775. This is a Newbury family, but they died in Andover on the same day. And their parents on their headstone said, "Though young, not too young to die, prepare for eternity." So people that clearly believe in death. And of course, images like this appear on their headstones. This is from Old Hill. That's not very ambiguous. And then right here at Oak Hill, we have this wonderful, this is a cousin of mine, George Noyce, son of Sewelby and Sarah J. Noyce, died in 1895. Now here's what they have to say about death by then. There is no death. That's what it says on the stone. There's no death. What seems so is transition. This is more exclamation points than I've ever seen on a headstone. This life of mortal breath is but a suburb of the life Elysian, whose portal we call death. That's a pretty stark contrast to, they're young but not too young to die, get ready, you're going to be dead too very soon. That's the whole idea of memento mori. So that's a little very abbreviated romp through theories about death. And of course, the Civil War brought a new kind of death to the doorstep of every family in this nation. Ironically, in part through the gruesome photographs of battlefield dead. I know, some of them were posed. It's okay, we can all move on. That comes up every time I give this talk. Someone says, Matthew Brady posed dead bodies. I'm like, they're still dead. Just let it be. This was the first time that such carnage had been recorded so graphically. And of course, people were trying to make sense of that scale of death and grief. Of course, on a simpler level, the enduring metaphor of sleep was also a hopeful sign that the deceased had found peace in their passing. there were certain practicalities that needed to be seen to if an appearance of sleep was to be captured by a photographer after death. Boston, again, Albert Southworth stressed the importance of calling the photographer immediately after death in order to mask the physical effects on the body. He said, quote, "The artist is required to transfer to canvas, paper, or marble the living features after the pulses cease to beat. More oftener is the daguerreotypist called to copy what life has left behind. Sometimes he may represent balmy sleep, but too frequently the last enemy has so marked his victim that the picture cannot be contemplated with satisfaction. But even in such cases, an artist may be able to make a faithful likeness under the worst and most forbidding circumstance if he is sent for as soon as possible." So don't mess around. Get the daguerreotypist in there. "With confidence and care, the drapery and posture of death will not be first seen and most forcible in the likeness." It's hard to imagine what the first few hours after death might have been like during that time. A family member would be sent to fetch the photographer. Locks of hair and other items would be removed from the body, and the body washed and made up for its portrait. Oh, it's the undead sending me a text. By the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, two additional phenomena in postmortem photography developed. Though the majority of infants were still photographed as if asleep, adults were rather gruesomely posed as if alive, seated at pianos, in rocking chairs, etc. Eyes were sometimes painted open. Children were posed in family scenes as if alive. The evidence of actual death was diminished. Again, this is an incredibly unusual card that shows the artistry of painting a child's eyes open. This is a particularly extreme example. This was long thought to be a hoax. It's not. This is Miss Jeanette Gleckmeyer of Montreal, whose mother had a photograph taken every day after her death for 10 days. And this is day 9. And then she was buried. Paradoxically, the rise of the funeral home business signaled the transition from simple postmortem portraiture taken at home to elaborate casket scenes complete with modern accessories of death. The pillowed and canopied casket replaced the wooden coffin, and flowers, wreaths, pillows, etc. all added elements to postmortem photographs to the extent that it's often difficult to find the body in all that stuff. Funeral parlor photographs with all their bells and whistles became a valuable source of income for these establishments. Again, it's a huge generalization over long sweeps of time, but the Civil War had a lot to do with this. People were coming home, again, bodies were being sent home embalmed. People traditionally had funerals in their parlor. And so why are funeral homes often in the biggest, grandest homes on the streets? Because people wanted to use the nicest parlor in town to have the funeral for their loved one, if not at their home. Also, the coffin becomes a casket, which before then was really a term for a jewelry box or a small box where you put special things. So this very obvious word associated with death becomes this sort of, it's a casket. It's something more pleasant. By the close of the century, as cameras became less expensive and exposure times shorter, it was possible for much more spontaneous photographs to be made, and this extended to post-mortem images such as these, all taken outside. Although almost all post-mortem photographs were private images, post-mortem photographs of public figures, I just showed you Victorian Albert, were also made on occasion. Ironically, the death that threw the nation into the deepest mourning during the period did not appear to have been photographed. As it turned out, however, an image existed but was suppressed. The photographer was Jeremiah Gurney, a noted photographer who's best known for portraits of Walt Whitman. He attended the funeral ceremony for Abraham Lincoln in New York City. There was a General Townsend, who represented the U.S. Army during the funeral proceeding, gave him permission to photograph Lincoln's body in state. And then when the Secretary of War heard about it, he ordered the destruction of all negatives and images. But one plate had been made, a copy had been made from that plate, and it was found in a descendant's effects after their death. So there's one picture of Lincoln in his coffin. Again, this is another one that the authenticity of it was debated for a long time, but it does seem like it is authentic. The photograph was finally published in 1952 for the first time in a picture biography of Lincoln. And part of this is because Mary Todd Lincoln forbade any photography of Lincoln's body. and her wish was granted, in part because she had been completely overruled in her desire to have the body sent straight to Springfield without any stops. So they gave her that they wouldn't take any pictures. She was concerned that the body would be disintegrating and unattractive, and she didn't want him to be remembered that way, logically so. So that was the arrangement that was made. Photographs of many of the things and events connected with the assassination and funeral were widely circulated, but there was also concern that pictures of Lincoln's actual body would inflame already extreme tensions with the South. Post-mortem photographs were nearly obsolete by 1920 as a much more sanitized and institutional way of dying emerged. Private photographs of open casket funerals are still taken. It's true. But the popularity and ubiquitous presence of staged post-mortem images is difficult, perhaps, for us to comprehend in the 21st century. I will say, I have yet to find a verifiable post-mortem photograph from the Newberys. The Newberys. How'd I do? Good? Okay, good. If any of you ever find any, I know, now you're going to look for them. Look at the hands. The hands are the tell. I would love to see one. We know that they were taken. We know that they were taken in every major portrait studio in Newburyport. They all advertise for it, but I have yet to see an actual photo. The only photo that I have, the only postmortem photo I have, is this one. Sorry. This is these are the victims of a drowning off of the Newburyport Bar in 1910, September 18th, 1910. And 3 days later, the bodies were returned. Now, for a long time, it was thought that these were two brothers that had drowned. 4 young men had drowned. They'd gone out together. But actually, reading the article, you can see that 2 of the bodies were sent to the undertaker at the same time in Newburyport and then sent off. So I believe that these were actually 2 unrelated young men, but they were clearly pretty heavily reconstructed. So they look more like each other than they would have otherwise. But as far as I know, that's the only one. Except, you know, there's lots of opportunity now where the selfie generation has taken this to a new level. I have to say the one on the bottom is the funniest because this is Grandma in her favorite Snapchat filter. And somebody posted this picture and said, we decided to send her off to heaven the way she lived. This was her favorite Snapchat filter. There you go. It still exists, the selfie generation. All right. So honestly, how many of you have a picture of somebody that's gone before? No. Yeah.
I have a bunch, actually.
Yeah, I think it's also it varies by tradition. There are some cultures where open casket funerals, people go up to the casket and take a picture, and that's the way it is. And that's not considered disrespectful or irreverent at all. So I think there is a cultural, my family does not do open casket funerals, never has, and I was so horrified the first time I went to one. It varies culturally, so I think it's an interesting practice. It's interesting to see that. Okay, we're going to switch topics a little bit from the actually dead to the fancifully dead. Talk a little bit about spirit photography. The first spirit photographs were most likely a genuine accident, a double exposure. Remember when we all had to take our film to Photomat, and sometimes there'd be like a weird thing in the background? Sometimes you'd pretend that it really was a ghost. The orbs and double exposures. Long exposure times meant that movement and light produced ghostly apparitions in the picture. In the 1850s, professional photographers clearly understood how these images were made and encouraged their production for entertainment purposes. In 1856, Sir David Brewster, obviously British, an important figure in the development of spirit photography, described in the book, The Stereoscope, Its History, Theory, and Construction, how ghosts could be made to appear in photographs for your amusement. Lines of stereo views were produced with names like The Haunted Lovers and The Ghost in the Machine. The process for making these images appear was available not only to photographers, but to the public alike. Despite that the information about how to produce spirit photographs was widely available, so strong was the 19th century rejection of death that the public stood, money in their hands, ready to accept photographs as proof of contact from beyond the grave. After the Civil War, a thriving belief in spiritualism provided large numbers of people with a philosophical and even, in many cases, a religious basis for the spiritual presence of the dead amongst the living. Spiritualism, which had quickly spread, accepted the conviction that the human spirit survives the death of the body. The conviction was based on what, for spiritualists, was the indisputable fact that the spirits of the dead could and were communicating with the living. Which sounds crazy, but I have to say, I think just about everybody I've ever had a deep conversation with after a couple glasses of wine has tried to tell me a story about this weird thing that happened in this old house that they used to live in. So it doesn't seem that crazy, right? Though a belief in the existence of spirits is common in many societies, and in fact, throughout American history, obviously, you know, the whole witchcraft trials is an excellent example of that. Spiritualism sought to transform this belief into empirically verifiable fact. Organizations were formed, journals were published, and public and private activities of all kinds took place. In fact, there was a congressional hearing in 1926 about spiritualism and whether or not it was rife with fraud. 1926, took a long time to get there. We're still in the 19th century here. Houdini testified at that hearing. The issue of human survival of death is one of considerable interest and debate, and the data available as proof was found acceptable by many people at every level of society. Much of this evidence was derived from mediumistic seances and took a wide variety of forms. Did you all play with your Ouija board when you were a kid? Okay, so that is a direct descendant of the planchette, of all these tools that were supposed to allow communication with the dead. If you ever want to really have a laugh, go on YouTube and Google misspelled Ouija board. All of the Google searches that misspelled Ouija board are read aloud by this hilarious commentator. Anyway, it's not an easy word to spell. So knockings, rappings, table tiltings were all seen as evidence of objects and of spirit beings. And photography quickly became another form of evidence. In 1861, when William Mumler, an engraver for a Boston jewelry firm, announced that he had not only made a successful spirit photograph, but he had been able to repeat the process. He went into business as a spirit photographer, providing pictures for $10 a piece at a time when normal portrait photographs could be attained for a few cents. The procedure was not substantially different from a normal portrait sitting. The person desiring a photograph of a deceased friend or relative would simply pose as if for their own portrait, and then the spirit would magically appear on the photograph after development. Response to Mumler's announcement in the spiritualist press is just beautiful. In 1863, the magazine in the spiritualist community said, "If spirits can appear and throw their image upon the glass so as to be visible to us, the whole question of impossibility fails. For the photographer's art is merely the preserving of such an image when once thrown upon his camera or plate." Fair enough. The American Journal of Photography was rather less convinced. "How wonderful is the recent progress of our art," said a 1864 article. "We are now, in the usual way, going through the process of having our picture taken, but when the finished photograph is presented, lo, beside our lonely image is an attendant spirit, a babe, a grandfather, an unknown. Spirit photographs show that the spirits dress in clothes of earthly fashion, that they sit in chairs, and that sitting for their pictures they put on smirks, which some have supposed to be simply for mortals." By 1869, Mumler had moved his operation to New York City. Did any of you, when you were a kid, wonder if there were ghosts, if they could come in the bathroom and watch? Did anyone go through this process with me? Angels sound awesome, and then you're like, sometimes I have to do things I don't want anybody to see. I feel that way about ghosts. If you're there, just, stay in your lane. Anyway, that was a big aside. By 1869, Mumler had moved his operation to New York City, where he was promptly arrested and charged with public fraud, larceny, and obtaining money under false pretenses. The arguments of the defense and prosecuting attorneys during the following trial corresponded precisely to the opposite sides of the argument over spirit photography itself. Mumler's defense attorney argued that he had used ordinary photographic methods and that his success in obtaining spirit figures was beyond his control. He also stressed that Mumler's procedures had been scrutinized and no evidence of deception found, and many customers had recognized the features of departed loved ones in his pictures, even in cases where no likeness of these persons existed. The fact that many of his spirit extras were identified as living beings was the central figure of the prosecution. The prosecutor offered a simple example and simple explanation. He suggested that the vagueness of spirit forms in Mumler's photographs left most of the matter of identification to the imagination of a grieving public, and that sitters credulously imagined that they saw what they wished to see. In his words, quote, "Those who went to Mumler prepared to believe, of course did believe, on very slight proof. This is all the evidence of recognition proves. It proves the existence of a belief in the statement, not the truth of that statement." Though the prosecutor was certainly correct in this assessment, the argument could be made to work both ways. The spiritualists who wanted to believe Mumler looked only at evidence that supported their belief. The skeptics did precisely the same thing. Since these two beliefs were diametrically opposed, it was impossible for either side to convince the other, again, ripped from today's headlines. The veracity of photography, however, was never at issue. Both sides believed implicitly that photographs did not lie, and both arguments depended on that presumption. Unfortunately for Mumler, he came under the scrutiny of the formidable P.T. Barnum. I kind of love this guy. The more I know about him, the more I like him. Except for the elephants thing. What's nice to elephants? Who testified against him in 1869. As part of his proof against Mumler, Barnum documented accusations that he had broken into houses and stolen photographs of deceased loved ones. And he himself hired a photographer to take a picture that appeared to show Barnum being visited by the spirit of Lincoln, which you can see there on the left, right, to demonstrate the ease with which that could be done. Though the weight of public opinion was clearly on the prosecutor's side, neither attorney was found to have proven their case because they couldn't prove how Mumler had done it, and the judge dismissed the charges for lack of evidence. I will also say that another very, actually, this accepted the presence of spirits, but there was a significant anti-spiritualism crusade in the Christian camp, which said that it was a trick of the devil. These were evil spirits that were tricking people into thinking they were their deceased loved ones. While mentions of other spirit photographers turn up in the spiritualist press, most of them wisely avoided publicity. They did not advertise, moving from place to place and quietly catering to the spiritualist community. The next spirit photographer who received wide international attention was the first practitioner in England, Frederick Hudson, who emerged in the early 1870s. Though skeptics abounded, he was difficult to catch in the act. In 1873, the editor of the British Journal of Photography investigated his behavior, bringing in his own plates and chemicals, but could not come up with the same results as Hudson. Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, who shares credit with Charles Darwin for the discovery of evolution, was a client of his and obtained two different photographs that he believed showed his dead mother. Now, this is an interesting person who deserves her own show. Detailed descriptions of sittings with Hudson are provided by Miss Georgiana Houghton, author of the first book on spirit photography. Now, this is, she's an interesting woman, and she's part of the reason that he was eventually prosecuted. She loved him so much, she publicized him widely. Essentially, her book is a description of spirit photography like this. It says, "We asked Mr. Hudson to prepare another plate. While he was doing so, we heard raps, but received a negative in answer for our desire to another spirit photograph. Notwithstanding my pleading, we were told that there would not be another. I still wished to try and asked if I was too willful in making this attempt, to which the answer was a brisk yes. But the plate had been gotten ready before the wrappings came, and I was anxious for the appearance of one of my two little baby sisters, whose birthday it was. Her dear little hands were playing about my head, and just as Mr. Hudson was focusing me, I felt the tortoiseshell dagger brought to me from Naples by Mrs. Guppy, withdrawn from my hair, and as he again covered the lens after taking the negative, the dagger was dropped onto my lap." So her comb was taken out of her hair. The room is pitch dark, by the way, pitch dark. So she's feeling things, comb comes out of her hair, the lens is open, then there's a flash of light. On our questioning Mr. Hudson to the result, he says, "There is no spirit, but in the air, above your head I see a cross." I then explained to him what it was, and as he had not noticed it, I gave it to him to look at what we had just found. So she told him that the comb had come out of her hair, etc. To say that Mrs. Houghton was a trusting and credulous person would be a grievous understatement. She lived under the guidance of a personal band of 70 archangels who chose her home, her wallpaper, the carpets, the furniture, and directed her feet when she went for a walk. She's perhaps best known for her spirit-led artwork, which you see here. She would go into a trance and do this, similar to what I did in math class in 7th grade. It's a real interesting sort of version of folk art. It's kind of cool. Since she believed implicitly in Hudson, her account often guilelessly reveals his methods. In one instance, she noticed that his assistant, a well-known medium, had been sitting behind the curtain behind them, this being the location where the ghostly figure emerges from. Other examples of his spirit photography indicate that British ghosts differ from American ghosts in that they are much more wrapped in frippery than mumblers. But they were no less recognizable to his customers than those across the pond. Oh, and then there's France. Spiritualism in France took a distinctly different, somewhat different form than it had in England and America. In France, it became allied with the already popular doctrine of mesmerism or animal magnetism. Mesmerism was a sort of a pseudoscience that talked about energy fields, and there were huge tubs of water that iron filings would be put in, and you would dangle your bits in the water and go into a trance. I'm explaining this very poorly. I have never actually been to an animal magnetism seance, but it sounded like a lot of fun. It was a system of healing designed for mystical tenets of the existence of a subtle or etheric body connected to all other living bodies in the universe. It was all about electricity, and this was brought out with various metals. A large tub would be filled with bottles of magnetized iron filings underwater. Patients would grip iron rods inserted in the tub, experience bodily sensations which led to a convulsive state, and then be cured. I would like to invite you all to give me a fistful of money and come put your hands on my electric fence. It's so fun, isn't it? Isn't it, Jimmy? Oh, it's so much fun. Similar sort of experience. The link of mesmerism to spiritualism came about through the fact that they were mesmerizing the cameras. They would pass electrical fields over these cameras, which would then take spirit photographs. So this is a Parisian photographer named Bouget, who routinely had himself mesmerized along with his camera. Bouget's career, which began in 1873, ended in 75. He didn't last long, when he was arrested on charges of fraud. His sensational trial followed the pattern of mumblers in most respects, but differed in one particular. He immediately confessed that he had never taken a genuine spirit photograph and told everyone how he had faked them. This, however, did not daunt his customers and supporters in the slightest. Witness after witness testified that they were satisfied that his pictures were authentic, and said that he was under the influence of negative spirits that made him pretend he had not taken them in the first place. Even when confronted in the courtroom with dummy heads, false beards, cheesecloth, and other paraphernalia, which the prosecutor insisted and Bouget admitted had been used to accomplish his results. One photograph caused a considerable stir when it was discovered that the spirit face belonged to a man very much alive, and he appeared in court and was very annoyed that he had served as a spirit for Bouget. The spiritualist position on the scandal, I said, is that he had made a false confession under duress or under the influence of evil spirits. The spirits in Bouget's photographs combine the drapery of Hudson's spirits with the incorporeal but clearly defined faces of Mummler. As opponents of spiritualism frequently pointed out, these are all popular notions of the appearance of ghosts, right? They all fit this idea of what ghosts might look like. The extras in these pictures were recognizable as spirits, if not necessarily the spirits of friends and relatives, because they matched the expectations of their viewers. There's one other one, and he's a doozy. This is William Hope. This is in the 1920s. Everybody's getting really creative. And this gets extra weird because in the aftermath of the Great War, of course, the aftermath of World War I, the spirit photographer William Hope developed a following for his work that included Arthur Conan Doyle, who was his biggest fan. Who is the Sherlock Holmes creator. He supported Hope against claims of fraud. He wrote a book called The Case for Spirit Photography in 1922. He ended his friendship with Harry Houdini when the magician claimed, again, publicly, that spirit photography was farcical. For believers in spirit photography, however, trickery was not an issue. Like spiritualism itself, it fulfilled a genuine need. For spiritualists, death was merely a state of being that existed after life. If it reassured them that life did not terminate, their convictions differed only in degrees from those of society at large. The majority sought the less extreme and more conventional means of assurance that their culture provided. These are, I think this is still Hope. Mr. Hope. You can see the sort of mist rising under the table. It's so cool. So just to bring this back around to Newbury, this is Jacob and Dorothy Stechionis. They are both very much alive. It was taken in 1935. They were the resident farmers at the Spencer Pierce Little Farm, where I was for 21 years. They are from Lithuania. It was taken the same year as this image. This was taken in their native Lithuania. This is Jacob's grandmother, Eva, and it was kept with family photographs and passed on to historic New England by Jacob and Dorothy Stechionis' daughters. This card was produced en masse, made into a postcard, and sent to relatives across the world, some of whom, like Jacob Stechionis, would never see their home country again. This is a poignant reminder to me of how important these images were in connecting families with their communities, even when so far away from home. And again, another example of how this changed culturally. This was very common practice in Russia and Eastern Central Europe until fairly recently, actually, to send postcards of a casket photo. Unless you think that Newburyport was not involved in this whole spiritualist phenomena, I will end with a quote from our own Newburyport Herald, who in an editorial wrote, during the Mumler trial, in support of Mumler. We were a fan. Quote, there are other powers in the universe besides the lever, pulley, and screw. And when the nature of gravity, magnetism, light, etc. are fully explained, perhaps spiritualism will open up in turn. In the meantime, Mumler may resume his practice of spirit photography here without worry. It's a safe place for Mumler. So there you go. I brought it back home. Back to Newburyport. Thank you. So I'm not awesome at crediting my photographs, and I need to get better at that. Some of these are from old adventures a lot of these are in private collections, but some good places to look. I'm happy to pass these on to you. The Burns Archive in New York City, the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, the Lawrence Hutton Collection, Princeton University, the Royal Collection Trust, and also our own Library of Congress are wonderful places to look for images like this. And of course, newspaper archives are absolutely wonderful, and we have a fabulous one here in Newburyport. So thanks to the library for so many incredible resources.
Nice job.
Thank you. It seems weird to say that that's so much fun, but isn't it kind of fun? It's just a whole different way of being in the world. Tracy.
You might have said it, I missed it, but when did they stop taking pictures of dead bodies in America and why?
So they didn't really. I mean, they really, I think there was sort of there are still, again, some people that do it today, and some cultures that do it today. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, when did they stop taking pictures of dead bodies and why? And I think it's part of this bigger trend where death is being removed from people's ordinary lives. So people would then go to the hospital to die. They would go to a funeral parlor, to be prepared for burial. So I think most of us don't have a whole lot of direct contact with dead bodies, and people really did all the time in the past. So I think once that changes, the idea of having a picture of a dead body gets creepy, right? Because it's not something that you're kind of used to interacting with. So I think that's when it changes. It really changes in the 20th century when we institutionalize death. I should have just said that first. Yes, Paige.
I had a question. There was a sort of the two pictures, the one of the dead child with the eyes closed and then said painted on eyes to show that they were open. Was it painted on the photograph or was it painted on the actual eyelids? I wasn't clear.
I think it was painted on the photograph.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I can't swear to that, but I think it was painted in the photograph. That was a little Photoshop. Oh, and the question was, did people paint the eyes open on the body or on the photograph for you watching at home? Any other questions about this? All right, I want you to go rifle every bin at Todd Farm and find me a Newbury picture. Thank you. Oh, wait, I have something up here that I wanted to share with you if you're interested. In our collection, this is not a post-mortem photograph, but a lot of these images were made into stereo views. Most of you have seen stereo views, but if you haven't, they're the world's first ViewMaster. So this is actually a picture of 2 sets of parents. It's in the newsletter. So if you are a member and you get the newsletter, you might want to come look at this because this image is in the newsletter. This is actually the Beecher family. It's in our collection. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe's, two of her brothers, and they're standing at the grave of their children. So this was a mourning card, not a post-mortem card, that was widely distributed, and people were sitting in their parlors looking at these people standing at a grave in 3D. It's kind of cool. So if you want to come and check it out, it's kind of a neat thing to see. There's no dead bodies, I promise. But if you've never looked in a stereo viewer, this is your chance. All right, come check this out if you want. If not, feel free to hang out as long as you need to get over everything I just showed you.